Hello everybody. You're watching a Novartis Enterprise Architecture training session. We hope very much that you will enjoy the information we share, and we welcome any feedback you want to share with the architecture community. In this session, I will use the term architecture as a synonym to solution architecture. I will focus on the needs that an architecture has to actually meet, and even more so, I will focus on what expectations an architecture description has to fully meet in order to be deemed sufficient. Well, last but not least, I will illustrate my views and opinions based on a simple example. A solution architect in an IT context anticipates the physically built-out computer system and captures his anticipation on paper. This paper-based description of the anticipated computer system is what we call an architecture description. So in other words, an architecture description is the manifestation of a computer system's architecture. It's the most tangible means that we have in order to express anticipated physical system structures as well as system behavior. Remember that architecture is not tangible anymore on the level of a physical system. Also, there is not one single module that would include a system's architecture. System architecture is, if you wish, a cross-cutting and intangible concern. This said, every system has an architecture, no matter whether it was consciously developed or it just accidentally occurred. Well, to please our desires for a more formal description, how about this one? An architecture description is the description of all significant architectural aspects of a respective computer system on paper. Well, while paper obviously is a placeholder for any media that provides the basis for capturing respective data and diagrams. So at its core, an architecture description is, first, used to comprehensively document and specify structures as well as behavior that need to be realized physically in order to implement, further improve, refactor, etc. an appropriate computer system. Second, an architecture description is also used to verify that functional and non-functional requirements are fully met by respective computer systems. Third, it is used to discuss trade-off decisions that need to be taken and to document the rationale behind such taken decisions. Then also to capture crucial assumptions, to test a system, and to prove that it will work before it is actually built out. Well, beyond the above said, an architecture description is obviously the key means based on which the architecture is communicated and reflected upon, be it inside the solution architect circle or with outside stakeholders all around it. The ultimate benchmark that a computer system, including its architecture, has to actually pass is that it meets its requirements, right? So let's look at it from that angle and find out what makes an architecture description sufficient as opposed to insufficient for a problem at hand. I've quickly pulled key elements together on this slide. Let's glance at them. We said that a computer system's ultimate success benchmark will always be that it proves it can meet its agreed requirements, as you can see here on this slide. But why do we squeeze an architecture elaboration and description step in here? Well, I hope that this is clear to you in the meanwhile. If we developed the computer system's architecture and captured its description accordingly, as outlined here on this slide, then we could prove on paper already that the anticipated physical system will realize all given requirements once it is actually built. So in other words, rather than building the system at a high cost and only then be able to measure its fitness for purpose, we, by elaborating its architecture first, only created a system on paper and verified already there that it is ready to carry its required loads. The second benefit we gain from not just building the system hands down, but creating its architecture description beforehand, is that we can now govern the build step of the system's implementation based on a tested, verified, explicit and consistent architecture description. Any physical deviation of the system from its architecture blueprint can now clearly be spotted, discussed, and accordingly corrected. Or, let's phrase it differently. If we had no architecture description, then based upon what would a system's architecture actually be constituted? Based on gut feeling, good luck, and very tightly crossed fingers? Now that we have seen why architecture is important and what needs an architecture description has to actually meet, I want to understand in more detail which criteria an architecture description has to fulfill so that we can flag it as sufficient. To be honest, this is simpler than it may look at first glance. Very simply said, must an architecture description prove that the anticipated and future physical system, which is built based upon it, will meet all agreed requirements, full stop. Well, let's be a little more lax here even. We can say that the architecture description must prove that it meets all architecture significant requirements. This lowers the burden of an architect significantly also. Architecture significance in the context of requirements means that either business criticality of a requirement is considered high, or cost of changing this requirement soon or in far future is anticipated as huge, or finally that the risk associated with a given requirement is considered severe, which means that high impact is combined with high probability for this risk to actually materialize. Architecture significant decisions are those decisions that have a considerable influence on the design of the architecture. This is why a solution architect gives architecture significant requirements star billing and treats all other needs as second-class citizens. Cool. It really is that easy. When an architecture description proves to demonstrate first that, and then explains how it actually meets all agreed architecture significant requirements, then we can flag it as complete, sufficient, fully adequate, etc. Along these lines, we can equally and clearly state that if an architecture description does not demonstrate how the significant requirements are realized by the anticipated computer in future, then this description is simply not sufficient. Instead, it is inadequate, incomplete, and so forth. Isn't this cool? Now we have a clear line between a sufficient and an insufficient architecture description. But how would we actually expect an architecture or architecture description to demonstrate and explain how it realizes, solves, meets, etc. an agreed requirement? That's a good point. To understand this better, I will use an example and also have to dig a little deeper into the nature of requirements. First, I want to distinguish between functional and non-functional requirements. A functional requirement expresses a functional capability that an appropriate system is expected to expose to its outside. Functional in the requirement context means primary feature, property, ability, etc. of a system. Thus, a value which a respective system actor expects to be there in any case. We can also say that functional requirements express the reason for a system to be there altogether, i.e. the reason or the reasons for a system's existence. Non-functional requirements can, in most cases, be seen as complementary to the functional requirements that we just looked at. NFRs, or non-functional requirements, express the quality side of the house. They are synonymously also often called quality attributes or simply just qualities. While not the ultimate reason for a system's existence, they are almost equally important nevertheless. Let's use the example of an ATM and an automatic teller machine that we are all familiar with. An ATM's set of functional capabilities are, for example, check balance, withdraw cash from account, deposit cash into account, change PIN, etc. If we take the change PIN functional need and look at its additional quality, i.e. non-functional needs, then we could imagine the following to be stated there. The change PIN operation must not last longer than 5 seconds. Well, another example for the same function could be operation must either perform fully or not at all. This NFR, so non-functional requirement, means that either the PIN is fully changed or the change operation is completely rolled back, so that, for example, a required system was down. NFRs of this like fall into the category of system consistency. To summarize, functional requirements express all needs, or all those needs that we expect the system to primarily meet. They are the reason for a system's existence. Non-functional requirements further qualify how the system provides its functionality to its outside. The typical categories that NFRs fall into are availability, security, performance, scalability, extensibility, usability, reusability, etc. There are many more, as you know. So far, so good. But still, we want to see how an architecture description is able to answer, or not, the following question. Does the computer system meet its requirement? Yes or no? For this question to be answered, we need to understand how requirements are phrased and stated. Let us stick to the ADM example, since this is well known and introduced now. Functional requirements can be expressed based on a vehicle UML calls use case. What you see here is a use case overview diagram, which provides a handy, at a glance overview of the overall functional offer this ATM makes. Also, use case overviews indicate usage relationships that exist between actors and respective system use cases. So, for example, the actor bank customer would expect a conduct ADM session use case to be available to him. Let us look into the withdraw money from bank account use case now. I have quickly sketched it here for you. Let's give it a closer look. So the basic flow of events is the most interesting proportion and section that we find here on this slide. You can read it yourself quickly while I talk to it. So what you see here is that the use case has also further specified a non-functional requirement in the special requirements section at the bottom of the use case description. I want to give you a quick UML refresher, just to make sure you understand exactly what use cases are about. So use cases are cornerstone pillars when it comes to describing the problem that is to be tackled. A use case describes or defines the interaction between an actor external to the system, so actors can but not must be human beings, and the system on its outside or surface. So a use case depicts the flow of interactions between an actor and the system from the actor's point of view. Thus, they describe the system's behavior in a black box manner. Use case specific non-functional requirements further express those quality aspects that need to be met during the flow of interactions. For example, a requirement that states that an interaction between actor and system must not last longer than X seconds, that it needs to be highly available, that it must be that and that secure, etc. So to summarize, use cases are used to capture functional needs for a given system. They are easy to grasp, so they are a good means and a good vehicle to communicate with stakeholders and to have these stakeholders confirm that what we have understood is actually right. And they are inputs to the architecture development process, which we will see in a second. Okay, now that we have seen how requirements are ideally captured and stated in order to depict system behavior, without yet stating how the system is actually going to realize them, well, now that we have done this, let us look at some architecture descriptions. Okay, for this purpose I have really randomly grabbed a few such architecture descriptions for ADM systems from the internet. Take a second and look at them. I guess that you and I have seen such architecture overview diagrams 1,000 times in our life, right? Some are more, some less impressive. Some talk about protocols, some point out data which flows between nodes. Some others highlight machine configurations, networks that get traveled, network segments and firewalls all along these ways, etc. The big question remains, even though each of these descriptions that are flipped through here is impressive and informative, does any one of these explain whether and how it meets given functional and non-functional requirements? It's a simple yes-no question. How do you answer it? Ultimately, we want to find out whether any of these descriptions are sufficient in the light of the criteria we defined beforehand. Remember that this was an architecture description needs to prove and demonstrate that it meets all required requirements, as well as explains how it actually meets them. So hold this criteria against the description that you see over here, remember the use case description that we have had on the previous slide, and then come back with the answer whether or not you deem these sufficient architecture descriptions. So what is your take? Mine is clear. None of these descriptions brings us any close to meeting our expectations. I can hold our use case against them and immediately spot a huge gap between what I want to understand, what I need to know, and what the descriptions actually disclose. Well, better not disclose to me. So, as architecturish they looked at first glance, as impressive some of these were from a number of boxes and lines perspective, as insufficient these turned out to be when we expected them to help us understand how the architecture realizes system requirements. This brings up another question, right? How do we do this better? How do we do this sufficient, and how do we overcome the significant gap? While a holistic architecture view model would consist of all viewpoints as outlined on this slide, I will use a cut-down version of this on the next slide to highlight key ingredients of a more sufficient architecture description than those I had picked from the internet. Don't get me wrong, this view model here is an adequate one to be used for real-world enterprise-scale systems. However, I prefer to walk you through a nutshell version in order to keep this training video small and crisp. So let's see how the trimmed-down version of this looks like. Okay, so let's start at the top with requirements. For illustrative purposes, I keep this fictitious. So we see that there are a couple of use cases as well as NFRs, which is, yet again, non-functional requirements. Based on the use cases, a solution architect needs to investigate, find out, and finally define how each of these can be realized based on anticipated, already existing, or to be purchased application components. I called them A1, A2, A3, and A4 in this example. Next, application components should not be too coarse-grained. They mainly contribute to a system's functional capabilities. Also, there are interrelationships that may exist among them. If there was just one big application component, such design would be called monolithic. While application components are the functional workhorse, they cannot be pinned into thin air. So application components need to be underpinned by respective enabling components, which are often providing technical capabilities to the application components upon them. Such technical capabilities are, for example, connectivity, if you think of the network, message-based information interchange between application components, if you think of message-oriented middleware, hosting capabilities, if you think of compute nodes like Unix servers or hypervisor systems like VMware. But also you can think of those components higher up in the compute stacks, like application servers, etc. A solution architect not just fleshes out the technology architecture underpinning, including all technical nodes and their interrelationships, but also explains how application components are mapped onto their underpinning technology nodes based on respective deployment diagrams. Now I hope that you can see on this simple slide how use cases and their use case specific non-functional requirements can be traced all the way through use case realizations, application component diagrams, via deployment descriptions down into the bottommost underpinnings, which are technology nodes providing technical enablement. And as you can certainly imagine, this trace can be used to test, verify, discuss, and reflect upon, etc., the architecture holistically as well as on paper. While already anticipating the physical system, it does not have to be built out at high cost. Okay, let's run through the ATM example just quickly and see how the respective steps would snap one into another. So we have the use case overview diagram as well as the NFRs as inputs to the first step. Well, honestly, this step you have already seen. We look at the functional requirement around withdraw money from bank account, which was detailed out here in a respective use case description. So far so good. This one we already saw, so let's move on. For the next step, the solution architect takes the use case as an input and reflects on different ways this use case can be realized based on the computer system's application, i.e. functional components. This is quite a creative step. It may be that the systems to be used are already given. In this case, there is quite a bottom-up proportion to this very step. However, and if a system is built from scratch, which is not that often the case, then respective application components can be shaped by the solution architect to perfectly suit the respective use cases. Yet again, the results of the previous steps are taken as inputs, and detailed responsibilities as well as natural interconnections between application components are derived from the use case realization. Obviously, a solution architect has to repeat this for all use cases over time in order to develop the complete application architecture viewpoint for the ATM computer system. But I guess this is clear to you anyhow. As a next step, the solution architect takes the hosting needs concluded from the previous steps, i.e. the application architecture viewpoint, as well as non-functional requirements to sketch a first approximation of this system's future technology architecture. A couple technology components, including connections among them, are pulled together like shown on this slide. What is not defined yet is the deployment relationship that will map application components onto their technology node underpinnings. A very simple version of a deployment model is shown on this slide. Obviously, architects would have to further qualify deployment relationships, for example based on quite detailed deployment descriptors. Also, there are more suitable depictions than the graphical one over here when it comes to express mapping information. Think of matrices, for example. On this slide, finally, I want to quickly demonstrate how different viewpoints can be overlaid. I use a sequence diagram here to perform a technical walkthrough across application and technology components. The color coding indicates that like the green ones are application components and the gray ones are technology components. Further, this is expressed by the stereotype information that is put into the boxes. I do this because I want to trace the whole part that a request-response cycle takes end-to-end and top-to-bottom. I've created this flow of events schema because I want to investigate the performance characteristics of the almost physical realization of this given use case. In my example, I do this proactively. However, consider a situation where you have a problem to analyze, like a performance issue, that a computer system has, and furthermore consider that such architecture descriptions are not available to you yet. How could you ever seriously analyze the root cause of this problem? Also, and if you plan a system, what could you use as a basis for simulating different loads on the system in order to verify that the architecture suffices? Even if you knew the number of concurrent users expected during peak times, if you knew all volumetrics around data exchange sizing and frequency, etc. Without a description like this one, you have nothing that you could hold all your questions again. Let us quickly summarize what a solution architect should and should not do when creating an architecture description. Well, the first and foremost again is that an adequate architecture description must explain how it realizes all architecture significant requirements, so functional as well as non-functional ones. Next, an architecture description must be complete to an extent that no external source, for example a smart solution architect who created it, is required to accompany the description. That none of the solution architects who created it has to sit at the table and explain how all its disconnected pieces have to be connected in thin air and based on their bright brains. So we want to have architecture descriptions that deserve their name and that are standalone assets, not requiring an army of experts which have to jump in whenever a sufficiently skilled but new architect raises a question. Further, we can hold common fundamental architecture principles, so indicators for good architectures, against an architecture description. I'm thinking of high cohesion and loose coupling principles here. A good architecture description should be highly cohesive. This means that it is highly inwardly connected, or in other words, it has a high number of internal interconnections. Our ATM example, which was based on a distilled AH view model, AH stands for Architecture Handbook, well, that distilled version of a view model actually fully met these criteria as we just demonstrated. High coherence gives us traceability. Even better, it gives us traceability beyond the architecture being connected up with its driving forces, i.e. its requirements. The example to the right does not show high cohesion. It is fully disconnected on the level of the architecture description. I'm not saying it doesn't disclose anything. Sure not. Isolated depictions of a network viewpoint, a functional viewpoint, and a zoning viewpoint, for example, indeed exist. However, they neither explain how they are internally interrelated, nor do they explain how they fly information in order to realize all architecture significant requirements. Therefore, a solution architect, or even worse, a whole group of solution architects, would have to be brought to the table in order to get the described pieces glued together meaningfully. Loose coupling is almost a consequence of the highly cohesive architecture description to the left. The more the architecture internally references crucial information, the less pointers it has to its outside, obviously. Thus, the looser coupled it is to other artifacts, experts, projects, structures, etc. all around it. Last but not least, a word of caution atop. Let us not forget that a good architecture description does not yet mean good architecture necessarily. One can describe a totally inadequate architecture very well from a purely descriptive perspective. However, missing or insufficient architecture descriptions are generally referred to as architecture smells. While not necessarily meaning that the not described architecture is bad, it is common industry practice to flag insufficient architecture description or descriptions as symptoms for bad architectures. Now, this was a very high-level introduction into architecture descriptions. Clearly admitted. There is a lot more to be said here. However, at the core of it, an architecture description that deserves the name has to demonstrate that it and explain how it actually meets agreed requirements. If it cannot sufficiently explain whether and how it does so, then we can clearly see it to be insufficient. Within Novartis, the Architecture Handbook View Model Description Standard, as well as its related development method, provides you as a solution architect, with sufficient crash barriers here. It points out important viewpoints, thus requests you to consider them consciously. However, neither the Architecture Handbook nor other architecture techniques out there replace your thinking and acting as a solution architect. Be aware of this. If you want to learn more about the Architecture Handbook, then watch this channel. There will be more sessions coming out soon. Having said that, I hope you enjoyed this session and that I was able to stipulate your nosiness. If you have any further questions all around this, please feel free to ping me anytime at ingo.arnold@novartis.com.